Okay, welcome to the post week 5, at least the Sunday version and the Thursday version of the Sumer Sports Show. I'm Eric Eager. I'm one of the VPs at Sumer Sports. I'm joined by Thomas Dimitroff, the CEO of Sumer Sports. Thomas, kind of a whirlwind of a day yesterday. The early games, were not like star-studded, but they had interesting endings in some cases. And then the 4 o'clock games had some, the Vikings Chiefs was a pretty good game. Eagles, Rams, Cincinnati, Arizona were all kind of interesting in their own way. And then the Sunday night game, of course, San Francisco kind of showed Dallas who was boss. So it was an interesting day. Thomas, how are you doing? I know I've been off for a couple of days, so we haven't chatted for a while. How you doing?
I'm good. I'm excited about jumping in. Look, surprised at that night game, to be honest with you. I'm a big Dan fan. I talk about Quinn all the time. Was just surprised, not by him. We'll talk about this a little bit, I'm sure, but the fact that Kyle Shanahan is who Kyle Shanahan is. He's obviously a very smart coach, and he game plans the hell out of it. And I was just really impressed with what he did. Of course, they have good players. Don't get me wrong. I just thought Dan was going to nut up and hit those guys in the mouth, which he does all the time. It was just a tough situation. It was just tough.
Yeah, San Francisco's in this weird place, right, where kind of everybody's healthy, right? Especially offensive front. The right side's a little, you had some issues. One of their guards went out in the middle of the game as well. But when you can get Kittle, McCaffrey, Ayuk, Samuel, all those guys healthy at the same time, and then of course the quarterback, which has always been kind of the question. Once that quarterback settles in, they're pretty good for Kyle Shanahan, whether that was Jimmy G or whether that was Purdy now. And when that quarterback's healthy, it's generally speaking a fairly solid group. And that has happened. And when you catch them kind of in that world, it can be sort of really tough, I think, to play them. I was expecting more. Not that we're going to talk about this game, I think, at the end a little bit. But I was surprised, of course, at Dak Prescott and how poorly he played. I don't think Dan Quinn's defense didn't do a great job, but they were on the field a ton. And they were in a lot of kind of, Pollard fumbled, for example. They were in a lot of like fast change situations that I don't think are very easy to defend against when you're a coordinator. You want to have the whole field, and Dallas unfortunately gave the Niners half fields at times. So that wasn't great. But I do want to start with two teams moving in complete opposite directions. One of your former teams, Thomas, the Detroit Lions, they moved to 4-1 with a 42-24 win over the Carolina Panthers. The Panthers are now 0-5. They're the last winless team in the NFL now that Chicago won on Thursday night against the Commanders. This is an interesting one because when I look at this game, and I'm going to throw up, if you go at Sumer Sports on Twitter, you will see all of these. You will also, if you sign up sumersports.com/subscribe, you will see all of these in your newsletter on Mondays and Friday mornings. When I look at this game, firstly, I actually see a decent game out of Bryce Young. I think a lot of it was actually in garbage time, but you actually did see Bryce Young move the ball, at least a little bit of positive EPA for him. And again, a lot of that in garbage time. But you saw at least glimmers of what I think the Carolina Panthers saw when they traded up for the first pick. But what I really see is a really, really dominant performance by the Detroit Lions. A 97th percentile early down and all around EPA per rush game for them. 14% of their plays were explosive. So 1 out of every 7 was an explosive play. Thomas, when you look at these two teams, you got to really like what Detroit's building, and they're a contender right now, I think, in the NFC, especially with what we just talked about with Dallas.
Brad Holmes and Dan Campbell, your buddy. I know you're a big fan. As I'm continuing to become more and more a big fan of what Dan's doing and how he just grabs those guys, and he's got such presence about bringing them along, right? Positive, everyone believing. The authenticity of it all, makes it so real. And I feel like that's an authentic team, right? What they continue to do, they're playing hard, they're jumping around, they're doing their things, they're filling as they need to on defense, they're flying to the ball, they're capitalizing on offense. Every time I watch Jared Goff, honestly, I shake my head. I'm like, wow, what a recovery, at least from my mind, of what, Jared was when he first came over, how he was at the end of his time in the, at Los Angeles. And I just feel like he's so dialed in with what that team is doing right now, of course. So look, I watch how they play, and I think, like you made a comment to me, this is a team that's for real now. This isn't just trying to prove that they're coming into the beginning of the season and all the hoopla about them. They legitimately have people that are playing well together. They're scheming well together, both offensively and defensively, and I am really impressed. I do want to toss it back to you because you think about Detroit, exciting to talk about them, right? A team that's out there that got completely crapped on, right? You cheer for a guy like this, right? Dan Campbell or Brad.
And Jared Goff.
And Jared Goff, you cheer for them, right? No question. They're in the Motor City. I think it's a really cool location for them to be doing all this. Let's flip it back around, though. Here we are, Carolina. I got a great affection personally for Carolina. I really do. I like Scott Fitterer a lot. I like what they do there at certain levels. It's a tough beginning to the season. How do you play that out? Do you think it's really hot there? What do you think they should be doing right now?
Well, I think it's really awkward, right? Because not only do they have a first-year quarterback, as everybody talks about, they mortgage the future a little bit for him. They also are very much we use this word, they're not trying to lose. This isn't something where they're playing for a draft pick because they don't really have any next year in the higher parts of the draft because they moved up to get young. Reports were that they wanted to trade for a number one wide receiver. The reports last year were that they turned down a couple draft picks for Brian Burns. So they're a team that wants to win. And I get that. Fitterer is in, I believe, so he joined in 2021. So you're talking about year 3 of a general manager's tenure. But you're in year 1 of a second term head coach in Frank Reich as well. So there's awkwardness there. This isn't Jonathan Gannon with the Arizona Cardinals, right? Where, you have Monty Ossenforth for first year, and you can kind of build it up. And even though you're not winning, there's encouraging things to take from it. Like this Panthers team, you don't know, like, does Frank Reich get a second opportunity? We've seen it before. Chip Kelly took over the 49ers in 2016 after a successful run with the Eagles in 3 years, but that didn't end well. Same thing for Frank Reich. Successful run in Indy, didn't end well. Chip Kelly lasted 1 year in San Francisco, 2-14. They went out and got Shanahan. They went out and got John Lynch and blew the whole thing up after trying, and I don't like this word, but what people would call a retread coach, a coach that has had success that you're trying to get into the stable to be a better, so that you can get some respectability. Like, that's what I see as like the absolute floor for this team, which is that they can't get wins in an easy division. Everybody's going to talk about, when you talk about the schedules for the NFC South. And does Frank Reich get a second year? Because the thing I see, like, I love Dan Campbell. I love Jared Goff. I think they're very self-aware. I think they're great men. I think that everybody that I've talked to that's worked for Frank Reich has said he's a good man. He's an honest person. He tries to, be the best, kind of person from a character standpoint. Like, I don't want to see this happen in Carolina. And so I'd like to see them get, some wins so that we can see them see this through.
Look, in no way do I think Frank Reich will be a one-year guy here at Carolina. I think there's too much to work on here. Everyone needs to put the brakes on a little. It's tough, though, right? Everyone's looking. You have an owner in David Tepper who's obviously very smart in the market, right? He cares, very similar to what Arthur Blank did, right, back in his early years. He really cares about this team. He cares about the fan base. He wants to make it right for everyone. Those owners put a lot of pressure on themselves, right? Even though they're worth tens of billions of dollars and beyond or whatever, they put a lot of pressure on themselves. I think honestly think Frank Reich is a very good coach. You and I've talked about that. Right now they have a situation that they're trying to get a young quarterback to operate. He had some tough interceptions yesterday, right? He made some plays, to your point, right? You had sent a note to me like, look, he's doing a solid job. You're bound to come up with interceptions. Any of us who have ever been in the spot of general manager, when you put a young quarterback in there, you're holding your ass literally every play. It's crazy how it is. And before you know it, they start hitting their groove. But understand that it's not like you go in there and you think all of a sudden you draft a guy really high, or you're working with him in the offseason and you go out and you laud him in the media. He's not coming in hitting the ground running all the time. CJ Stroud is a different story, and we'll talk about him in a little bit, right? Sometimes that does happen, but there are many reasons for that, right? It could be strength of schedule. It could be the defensive coordinators that Frank Reich is teeing up against this year. They may know more. There are so many things involved. All I'm saying in the end, this organization needs to continue to grow with a quarterback like Bryce, right? Get him the ball, moving it around, get him more and more confidence. And the idea that you mentioned there, that there was talk that they were interested in trading for a receiver. Where did you hear that? I'm interested. Was it just something that was, bantied about, or did you seriously hear
No, this was not inside information from me. This was, through a source in the league, right? So there was Tom Pelissero, I believe, was the one that broke that on Twitter. It's a good question by you, Thomas, because I honestly don't know if I would give up more draft capital to, I would start to get some young players into the fold. I mean, the obvious pot shot that somebody could take at the Panthers is you traded your number one receiver to the Bears, and he had 230 yards and 3 touchdowns on Thursday. I don't think that that's necessarily fair. We talked about this when we were at the Super Bowl in February. I would have traded Brian Burns just because I think when your quarterback is young, it's like the Chiefs, and the Chiefs are obviously not a great example all the time because their quarterback's better than every other quarterback except for maybe a few guys. But like when they had Mahomes, they said, we're going to put all the resources into the offense, and if the defense falters, that's fine, because the number one objective when a quarterback is on a rookie contract, and hopefully you can back me up on this, is to figure out if he's good. And if you add any ambiguity to that thing, right? That's why, and everybody gives the Bears a lot of crap for this, and I'm going to be a little empathetic. When Ryan Poles traded for Chase Claypool, like, okay, that was an expensive price, but you got to get an evaluation on your quarterback, and you got to surround him with talent like your linemen and receivers and running backs. And if it comes at the expense of your defense, like, I think the Panthers would be perfectly fine winning 3 or 4 games this year if Bryce Young puts up Cam Newton type numbers and he was a rookie and that kind of thing. No one remembers that Cam didn't win until like year 3 or 4 because they figured out a way to develop him. And so I would have traded Brian Burns instead of DJ Moore, and I think that the Bears probably would have preferred to trade for Brian Burns as well. But all of that is water under the bridge. For me, I think that the trading for a number one wide receiver now, I get that it helps you get an eval on your quarterback. So in that sense, I like the idea, but I think that all that is doing is kind of at this point plugging a hole that you opened when you traded for Young in the first place.
So I often think about teams or fan bases and beyond, media throwing shots at general managers and head coaches for moving quarterbacks, right? Young quarterbacks or first round quarterbacks that they didn't work out with, right? But then I flip over to John Robinson being at Tennessee, ostensibly being terminated because of, a lot of people wanted to think it was because of a receiver move. I'm just telling you, I don't think receiver moves are reasons that owners are going to look at their decision makers and say, you guys F this up, we're moving on. I think that's quite shallow. That said, I will say that owners will look at a gathering of moves, right? I've said this all along to you guys, even as we've been working together at Sumer. It's the big moves that are made that decisions are made upon and that judgment is carried upon. It's not on the 5th, 6th, or 7th rounds or the free agents. When you hit on them, great. If you're not hitting on 1, 2, and 3 consistently, doesn't matter where it is. I'm not even talking about Carolina. I'm saying in general, the owner's going to look at it. If you're an owner right now and you had a general manager and your head coach, but you'll say your general manager, Eric, making moves that moved away someone who went to another team and he was extremely productive. Are you hanging that over your head coach, your GM and your head coach's head? Or are you saying, all right, This is a organizational decision, because mark my words, this is not just the general manager making these decisions. They sit down with the head coach, of course, and they sit down with the owner and maybe a couple other people. And they have a strong discussion about the finances of it all, about the length of the contract. Look, there had to be a reason that DJ left, right? It wasn't just financial. It's a combination. People aren't letting their studs go unless there's an issue. And that's the same about re-signing.
Well, I think we're going to talk about that Wednesday when we talk, because, by the way, I was at a game yesterday, and somebody came up to me at the game. Somebody who worked for one of the two teams and lauded that podcast, which I was very excited to hear that these people are listening. We really do appreciate you listening to our show, and obviously the feedback and everything has been awesome. This Wednesday, we are going to talk about player evals and how they do change when you talk about the signal of why is this player available, right? People don't, to your point, you just don't trade a DJ Moore for no reason, right? And so there's questions about, like, okay, if you have him rated a certain way, why, or let's say you've rated him a certain way, but then a team comes and says, hey, we're willing to trade him to you. Does that make you change your mind because you know that there must be something up? A very interesting, I think, point to get to here on that, because to your point, like, these things aren't as simple as Joe Schmo on the outside looking at it and playing fantasy football and everything. There are people involved, obviously. And again, I think that the fact that there are people involved also means that when teams are struggling like the Panthers and teams that were predicted to struggle like the Cardinals, they don't just want to lose the rest of their games and get a draft pick, right? There are people involved. You want to get an eval on players, and it's really, really difficult to get an eval on players when you're not a viable football team. And so I think that's something to think about. Again, we're going to go continuing the theme of teams that are struggling a little bit here. Let's talk about the game that happened between the New Orleans Saints and, again, another one of your former teams, Thomas, the New England Patriots. The New Orleans Saints, who really have struggled in previous weeks, obviously giving up a 17-point lead to the Packers 2 weeks ago in Lambeau Field, and then followed by losing at home to Tampa Bay. They went on the road to New England and pretty much, were relatively flawless, especially defensively. You look at New England. New England had one of the worst days ever in terms of expected points added per play. Mac Jones in the passing game, 23 points basically lost in the passing game. Ezekiel Elliott in the running game wasn't that much better. The Saints, not great throwing the football, especially, yards per play. EPA per dropback was okay, 60th percentile. Run game was below average. Derek Carr still nursing an arm injury. But this is, alarming, right? They've lost by 69 points combined the last two weeks. New England has a lot of issues about the quarterback, a lot of issues wide receiver. Juju Smith-Schuster Thomas has the lowest yards per target of any player in NFL history that's had more than 20 targets in a season. So this is a really tough situation for the Patriots, who sit at 1-4 for the first time since before your era. It was the first year of Bill Belichick. They started out 0-4, and they got a win in their fifth game. I mean, where do we start on this one?
Let's start by the guy that I drafted in my very first fantasy league last year. And by the way, everyone, just so you know, in the NFL, it's heresy that you play fantasy football. But of course, given our company here, I had to dig in a little bit and see if I could do it. But I'm saying Kamara obviously had a nice day, right? It was fun watching him run a little bit. Just feel like he runs hard. So look, I am, let's get to the reality of it all. This is a really, really interesting sort of downtrodden situation in the area of New England, right? Everyone's wondering. Bill Belichick is and will be the best coach, I believe, in hands down, arguably one of the very best ever, but in modern football beyond, right? He's right up there with the very best of them. And if he gets, I don't even like saying the word. It's like I can't even say it. But if he were to move on somewhere else, he gets snapped up in a heartbeat and turns an organization around, I believe. Those are the kind of situations, again, you don't need Bill to be talked about this. There's other people out there. There's some other really good coaches out there. And if they ever came available, these owners, you don't think they'd be sitting there going, gosh, I just bought this nice car, this new car, but maybe there's an opportunity to get a guy like this. You don't think that is something that is tumultuous within an organization, right? There's a lot to talk about there. So again, it's tough to watch New England do what they're doing offensively and to watch a quarterback perform as he is. This is the second time he was pulled in the second half, right? I mean, that's a big
and for a quarterback in Bailey Zappi out of Western Kentucky that was released after training camp because
exactly.
I don't know why. Like, and it's interesting. I got, to your point about Belichick. Like, no one wants to talk about the F word with Belichick, and it's tough, right? Like Chuck Noll in 1991, that team, eventually ran its course. Obviously, the biggest one was when Jerry Jones bought the Dallas Cowboys and fired Tom Landry and put in Jimmy Johnson. That thing really bottomed out. I think that there are people who will analyze Bill and say the game is different now and all this kind of stuff. And obviously Brady's a huge deal. And we also like to live in these like sort of Boolean settings where, now we're all figuring out it was just Tom Brady. And that's of course silly. Like obviously Bill Belichick, that game plan he had against the Rams in 2001 in the Super Bowl is still a masterpiece. And obviously, he's done so much. There are times, however, where things just kind of run their course, right? And I do think that there are some issues. Belichick is still able, and maybe I want your opinion on this. Belichick is still incredibly gifted to the point where even with this roster and the atrophy that it's had over the past 3-4 seasons, he can still win games with this roster. And do you think at all that gives, does that hinder things, right? Where he's so good at game planning and scheming. I mean, he's held the Miami to their second worst offensive performance behind Buffalo this year. Does that hurt at all? Because when I look at this team, I just see a roster that doesn't have that many. Like, what is their right to win as a roster? They're not terribly good on either offensive or defensive line. I think they're pretty good in the secondary, especially scheme. Quarterback is struggling. Wide receivers, there's not necessarily a group in football that I would want to have least. And so is there an issue with the fact that like most coaches would lose worse with this roster than Belichick? And so maybe there's not as much of an impetus to start over because he can still get a team like this on his worst season to 7 to 10 wins just by his coaching alone.
Yeah, I think he can coach people into unbelievable areas that they probably shouldn't be in. Let me jump back here for a second, however, Eric. You had last year an offensive coordinator situation that was really complicated, right? And dicey and dusty in a lot of ways, meaning how do they pull it off, right? And then this year, of course, they have it again with Bill O'Brien in a situation, right? Where does all that fall? If again, you're in that organization, or let's just ask you your perception, starting with the offensive coordinator situation, right? And 2 years in a row where things are the way they are. And then you have a quarterback who's losing confidence with the seconds.
Yeah.
What do you do? And how do you approach it? You can take I'm not being facetious in any way, but I am also kind of pushing you a little bit. If you're the assistant GM somewhere and you're saying, okay, what can I analyze here analytically to determine to get us out of this hole? Given the situation, Bill O'Brien is the coordinator. Yeah. Bill, probably offense and defense. There's a lot going on.
And he's had success in this league before. He's also had success in college football. Unlike the guys that were running the offense last year, there's precedent for Bill O'Brien to have some success. Bill O'Brien took that Houston team to the playoffs multiple times with, the situations that we've all seen happen before. So in my opinion, this is a really tough thing about taking a quarterback where they did. And maybe let's talk about this as far as the historics. When is the last quarterback that was taken after the first dozen picks in the first round? When has a quarterback ever had sustainable success? And I sort of want to throw this in here a little bit. The NFL market for picking quarterbacks is not perfect, but it's efficient enough where all of the guys who have the true top end talent to be any good, they're all selected in the first 12 picks. And this is a very good counterexample by Beat Gamer Lamar. I'll say this: Lamar and Teddy Bridgewater, picked at 32, have been okay. But for the most part, if you want to take a quarterback and you don't want to depend upon luck, you have to take that quarterback in the first, and obviously Watson and Mahomes are taken outside the top 10, but you have to take, I think, that quarterback high. And so when they went and got Mac Jones at 15, and Mac had a decent year in year one, all of the gears start rolling for what people will call sophomore slump, which is just regression, right? When you take a quarterback who no one believes has that many physical gifts like Mac, and you take him to the playoffs at 10-7, he makes a Pro Bowl and all that stuff, what happens to the offensive coordinator? He gets a head coach job, right? Almost every time, right? Every single time that offensive coordinator leaves, and then he's replaced by somebody who's not quite as good. And that person, in the case of Joe Judge and Matt Patricia, weren't necessarily even that wasn't their position they coached. And so you get regression in those ways, and then it kind of spirals out of control. And so I think and I wrote an article on Sumer for this. It's just it's why it's so difficult to be above average all of the time, because there are so many headwinds when you don't, because if you have a great quarterback, you're going to be more or less much above average, right? And if you have a bad quarterback, you're going to be picking good quarterbacks in the draft, hopefully eventually. It's that middle of the road where that quarterback depends upon so many extraneous factors, and those extraneous factors, they ebb and flow year to year. Juju Smith-Schuster's good one year, terrible the next, right? All this kind of stuff. Offensive linemen get hurt. Offensive coordinators get head coach jobs. To me, I think that the folly is being in that middle of the pack road with your quarterback. And we just talked about him, other than guys like Jared Goff, other than guys like Brock Purdy, it's really hard to sustain that. And you can't sustain that, in my opinion, without an offensive mind that is above, in 75th percentile or better. And the Patriots simply haven't had that.
They haven't had it. I completely get it. I don't know where we go with this conversation beyond here, besides the fact that, to have a record as they do, and these last two losses, and to watch Bill walk off and address the media, no one's feeling sorry for him. I get that.
Yeah.
He's won a ton, right? Any of us who have ever been in the NFL, no one's feeling sorry for people who have made, everyone in our business, interestingly enough, you all will get a kick out of this. It's always like, guys made hundreds of millions of dollars, and no one's crying for them, of course, right? The people who have been really successful and aren't. But now is the time to see, okay, how do they recover? Do they recover? Yeah. Or is it gonna be what Rich McKay told me, the president at the Falcons? It never ends well, Thomas. By the way, how's that for a little bit of foreshadowing? But anyway, I mean, we can continue to talk about this one. I feel bad that it's in this situation. I've always thought that, it might end well for the great ones. Sometimes it doesn't necessarily end as smooth.
I mean, even Tom Brady, Thomas, right? The two best quarterbacks that have played in this era, right? Peyton Manning and Tom Brady have had as good of endings as you could have asked for. Manning with the Super Bowl, Brady basically being MVP caliber until his first retirement, and then he came back and won a division. But even them, Thomas, it didn't fall. But you watch every single one of these quarterbacks. Dan Marino, his last year was 10 touchdowns, 17 interceptions. Same thing for Peyton Manning. Brett Favre with Minnesota in 2010, 12 touchdowns, 19 interceptions. It just the first person that walks away while they're ahead. I mean, we've seen the casinos have all the lights in the world because no one can walk away while they're ahead, right? All this kind of stuff. And I think it's true. I mean, and so to your point, it might not end well. And I think we always expected Belichick to ride off into the sunset because he's played every single play his whole career perfectly for the Patriots. And it seems like in this one particular instance, it might have rolled snake eyes for him.
Remember, if you guys all remember, when you talk or listen to Bill Polian, and he made a categorical comment. Past 10 years, he was referencing general managers and head coaches. Back to the Rich McKay comment, it doesn't go well, right? It starts to be time to leave after 10 years. Bill Belichick's been there, 22 or 23? I think came in there in 2000, straight up, right?
Yeah,
22.
Bill got the job in 2000 for
Yeah.
Pete Carroll.
I mean, that's a long time, of course, right? And has done unbelievable things, as we say. And this isn't all about Bill today, but the reality is there's going to be someone else one day taking over there someday of his own volition or not. And that person's going to have an unbelievable mountain to climb. And, I've heard all kinds, in New England, we all talk about not us as employees, but the people in New England. Who's the next, right? Who's the heir apparent? Who does Robert and Jonathan Kraft, who will they have next when Bill hopefully leaves of his own volition, right, Eric? Who will be that? Who will be the combination? Who will come back from another team who didn't really work out that well as a coach, or who will come back as a GM or as a personnel director to be the number two because one day someone else comes back as a coach? There's a lot of that going on there, right? There's a lot of discussion about that amongst the media and such. So,
yeah, and I think it'll end up being surprising there. It is interesting. I want to segue this because this is a coach who has been not quite, in my opinion, when you rank coaches all time, this man is in the Belichick tier, but I put him below, and that's Andy Reid. Andy, of course, when he was with the Eagles, 4 conference title games appearances in a row. Or no, sorry, 3 in a row, 4 total. He had 1 Super Bowl appearance. They went 4-12 in his last year. It did not end well. He was snatched up in a millisecond by the Kansas City Chiefs and has had that second career. I think that if Belichick wants to continue to coach, that is far from impossible as an outcome for him. It's just obviously, that one of the issues with Bill is that his Patriots have never been as bad as the 2012 Philadelphia Eagles were, and hence he hasn't had to go through that yet. This is Kansas City versus Minnesota. This was played in Minneapolis. By the way, Minneapolis, that stadium, as good of an on-field production as I've ever seen at a stadium. Phenomenal stuff. I think this game was maybe a little bit closer in the scoreboard than it really was. The Chiefs had a really good game offensively. Patrick Mahomes, like I said, 89th percentile EPA per pass. They did actually sack him a couple times, which is usually, not going to happen for Mahomes. There were some kind of borderline plays as far as, some people would have wanted to see pass interference on the last 4th down, et cetera. But Kansas City gets out of Minnesota with a 7-point win. Travis Kelce comes back from an injury, scores the final touchdown for Kansas City. Kirk Cousins, 35th percentile EPA per dropback. They actually were pretty effective running the ball when they did it. This was a contrast in 2 teams kind of going in opposite directions. The Vikings are now 1-4. They're 3 games behind Detroit. Kansas City, after losing to Detroit in week 1, have now won 4 straight. Kind of a classic game for both teams, Thomas. What did you come away with this game thinking?
Hold on to the effing ball. What can we do about that, by the way? I'm being a little funky about that. I'm perplexed. I've been in situations like that. Sometimes it's like when you have the fumbles or whatever it is, the turnover situation, it's like it's just always in your face, right? And it's almost like gut wrenching because you work on it. Dan Quinn and I worked on it I forget what exact year it was. We worked. We put springy balls coming out of walls in our facilities. People were going by. Everything was about that, right? Getting it out, but also keeping it in. That said, what I want to go with this quickly, and then we can come back to your question is, 1-4, you were the soothsayer. You were talking all last year, even at the beginning when it was very close. You're like, look, this is going to be a completely different team next year. Eric, to your credit, and no offense to Kwesi Adolfo-Mensah. I'm just saying you saw the writing on the wall on certain things. Do you want to expound on that a little bit for the group? Because I think that's a really, really good insight.
And I'll give Kwesi some credit too, because he let go of Dalvin Cook, a player who had 1,000 yards last year. Adam Thielen, who actually has been okay for Carolina, but I think he's part of the issue there as well. So Kwesi moved off of players maybe a year late, but every player he moved off of was actually, fairly reasonable to move off of. But to your point, last season, they were 11-0 in 1-score games in the regular season. They lost a 1-score game to Daniel Jones and the Giants in the playoffs. And then this season, every game has been a one-score game, and they've lost 4 of them. To your point, a lot of it is fumbles, a lot of it's red zone stuff, but it goes to show you when you try to handicap football, you have to handicap what's fundamental. And what is fundamental is play-by-play efficiency, especially in the passing game. And what's not fundamental is red zone ability, turnovers. All those things are just pretty random year to year. So if you're doing if you're struggling with turnovers and stuff, it'll generally speaking turn around. It's just that it does snake bit you. I remember, Thomas, your 2017 Falcons, because your 2016 team obviously, made the Super Bowl, everything. The following year, other than I thought Sarkisian was a good coordinator, and I thought that you guys led the league that year in third down drops, and you still had a top 10 offense, but it was just like everything that was bouncing your way one year doesn't the next, and it's like that doesn't mean you guys are a worse team. It just means that luck sort of bounces in some directions and not. And this Vikings team, I'm going to tell people, they're not necessarily all that worse than last year. You combine easier schedule last year, 1-score bounces. Like they were in London this time last year. That kick by the New Orleans kicker hits both uprights and the crossbar and doesn't go in. And now Kansas City gets a play where Justin Watson's toes are barely in, and it changes the complexion of the game. And so it's just my issue is, and I know that this isn't how people think, but like when you live that close to the edge, you have to live with the swings. And right now they're dealing with a horrific run of bad fortune, and a lot of that has to do with the fact that their quarterback is not necessarily a guy that elevates the play of those around him.
Well, and that's probably where we need to go, or we can just table it for now and continue to watch through the season and see what Kirk Cousins does, right? I mean, you and I have talked about this. I mean, where do you think he is? Get your statistical mind going here for a second. Do you think he's a top 18 to 20 quarterback? Or
go ahead. I think he's firmly a top 18 to 20 quarterback. I think you'd probably put him at like 12.
Wow.
But I think 12 is still hard to win with, right? Because you think about this, Thomas, like you are dealing with the dead money from Harrison Smith's restructure, the dead money from Danielle Hunter's restructure, Dalvin Cook's money. You're dealing with, some of Zadarius Smith's money, if I'm not mistaken. Like, Rick Spielman did a lot of great things in Minnesota, but he didn't leave Kwesi with a great book, right, of contracts. Mm-hmm. And so I think a lot of people got high off of last year's, wins and losses, but didn't really understand what was out in front of them. And Matt Ryan can overcome that. Tom Brady can overcome that. Matthew Stafford maybe can overcome that. Jared Goff probably can't, right? Which is why Detroit has been so good for him, because Detroit started over and said, whatever we are, we're going to be. And the Vikings, unfortunately, and I know Kwesi said this, they called it a competitive rebuild, but like that's incredibly hard to execute, right? And so even though they were great last year, competitive last year, record-wise, the bill was always going to come due. And I think, unfortunately, if you aren't communicative, and this is a great question for you, if you aren't communicative with the expectations of, okay, I know we won 13 games last year, Mr. Wilf, but we're really an 8-win team, and we got lucky a bunch. Give me some time. Like that's a really hard thing to communicate to an owner sometimes.
It's not easy. Luckily, I mean, Kwesi has got an ownership group there in Ziggy Wilf and Mark Wilf, good people. They want to do well for their group, right? They work together well. They give them all they need to have there, right? They put it in. They put their heart and soul into that. Not saying most owners don't. Some do it with angst, of course. Others do it with belief and faith and loyalty. And I think the Wilfs are really good that way. So I think it works in his favor. I mean, look, they have good people there within that building. You know that. I mean, even as far as Rob Brzezinski, he's been there for a long time. You're talking about contracts that were done or Rick had done them, but Rick is working with Rob Brzezinski. Rob is really good at what he has done, what he has done and his contracts. That, that said, there's always going to be the ones that are complicated and mixed, right? So I'm just saying that they have a good group of people there, as you know, and I think you know them over there at Minnesota. But this is going to be one of those years that could be very up and down. And now you see how everyone pulls in the right direction. or if it's the same direction, right? I mean, look, I've been on the side where it's not been pulling in the same direction. And inside that locker room, it can get really tumultuous fast. And what was thought last year is not thought this year. And all of a sudden, going into the third year, ownership's a little bit more like, okay, show me what you have here.
Well, and the Cousins discussion's a really good one, because you are somebody who, I think, when you're just a great culture person. You encourage people. Like, even when we have meetings at Sumer with people you don't normally talk to, you are like, it's something that I admire. There are parts about this when you watch that quarterback documentary. I see similar things, right? Kevin O'Connell, after a game where Kirk Cousins played poorly, but they won in Washington anyway, his old team, all this kind of stuff, he says the only reason we are the way we are is because of our quarterback, which is 100% a lie, but something you have to tell somebody who very clearly has the sort of insecurities of a guy like Kirk Cousins, for better or worse. And that's awesome when you're winning all those games. I think the question becomes is, okay, Kirk is on the final year of his deal. You're not winning. Can he maintain that same positivity? Because to your point, when you're winning and all the culture's great, all those things compound on each other. When you're not winning, does he break, right? Well, a person who all the way back to Washington has had that quarterback's back and ostensibly has Kwesi's back and has, the culture there, I think it was the plus. Mike Zimmer, fabulous coach, this has been reported before, so I'm not breaking any news. He did not want the Cousins signing, right? And it feels like every single time he talked to the media, you could tell that he didn't believe in his quarterback. That's not a great situation to have. Even if he's right, he's still wrong, because he's your quarterback and you have to try to win. The question I have for Minnesota is, can you maintain the good things that happened last year from a culture standpoint when the good things on the field in the record book are not happening? Because that, to me, is the big test of this new regime.
It's hard. It is hard to do it. Not saying you can't. You have to really pull together. You have to have really strong leadership. Of course, your coach and your coaching staff. Your coaching staff has to be behind your head coach. You know that. And to your point, behind your quarterback, right? Or you quickly lose. You lose momentum. You lose the energy. And, those who have played football, those who are listening to this that have a grasp of sport, realize how important that is. But to your point, you can't feign it, right? You can't feign it. There's a time where you have to stand up and be very honest with, how you're going to approach everything. So I'm not speaking in riddles here. I'll be really interested to see how they play through the rest of the season. We'll revisit this over the next quarter, I'm sure.
For sure. Let's do our last game. I know we talked Dallas, San Francisco. I know we're also running out of time a little bit. Yeah. And Dallas, San Francisco, frankly, Thomas, I'm going to tell you, I thought the game would be a lot more compelling when I made the show notes a couple days ago. And so that's just a bad prediction out of me. I'm just going to say, you gave me plaudits for predicting the Vikings would not have as good of a record. Now I'm going to go the other side and say, I thought that San Francisco Dallas game would be more of a old school, 1990s NFC Championship game than it actually was. So let's talk though about a game that actually was close and actually did have some compelling elements to it, and that is the Houston Texans, who are now 2-3 after a loss in Atlanta to the Falcons, who are now 3-2. We talked about this, I think, a little bit Wednesday. This was a huge game, right? The Falcons, going into the weekend, had the easiest schedule left in the NFL per our power rankings. The Houston Texans had the third easiest schedule. So whoever was going to win this game was going to have an inside track at making the playoffs in their respective conference. This was one that went back and forth. Falcons scored to go up 7-3, and then Houston scored a bunch of field goals that they probably wished were touchdowns. The Falcons ended up scoring a touchdown, getting it out to a 6-point lead before Houston came back and scored. And then the Falcons, behind a guy you acquired in the middle of one of your last season, Younghoe Koo, ended up kicking the game-winning field goal, and they ended up getting out of there. Now, I was a little bit disappointed with the gameplay here. I thought that you would see a little bit more aggression from both teams. It felt like both teams were kind of trying hard not to lose as opposed to trying to win. But you did see, as the graphic showed, Desmond Ridder had his best game, and he was efficient. He did some things. Now, that Houston defense is both banged up and not particularly great to begin with, so it remains to be seen whether or not Ridder can continue this. but it was I don't know if it was necessarily an encouraging game for the Falcons, but I'm sure that they're glad they got out with a win.
You just said it. Obviously, you can't come away watching that game not thinking there are glimmers or more of hope for Desmond Ridder and that offense, right? Put him in the right spot with the right system, not just system, the right scheme in a game from game to game. Personally, I think get creative. Don't do the same thing. Don't have this whole, and I've been a part of these offenses before where they've been so predictable. And you get a younger guy like that with little experience or limited experience like Desmond Ridder, who wants to do well, right? People cheering for him. They're talking about how big his voice was, right? And he was so fired up. I mean, good for him, good for the Falcons that way. But you can't get consistent with a player like that, in my mind. Got to get really creative. And I thought they even hitting the fullback, up the seam, right? Things like that were good. And again, very good on Arthur Smith to be calling the plays the way he was there for Desmond. And Desmond was rifling him in. He was cocking it back and going, which I was excited to see. I thought he was going to come back this past game, and I thought he was going to be nervous Nelly. So to his credit, man, he had some competes about him. That said, I'm not going out there saying 100% you got your guy a guy. Just like I don't believe you got your guy a guy yet with Zach, right? I mean, there's all that banter, and again, I wasn't throwing a dart in any way at Chris Collingsworth, by the way, a little aside.
Well, okay, but you also, like, Zach Wilson didn't play well yesterday either. He is who he is. Like, Chris was going overboard about this, and and I think he knows that too. Yes, your point is, like, though I have a phrase for this, which I hope that we'll adopt. He was encouraging, not good. Like that, right. Encouraging is different than good.
And Desmond Ridder was encouraging for that team. And they got the damn ball to Pitts, which I love to see.
Thankfully,
that cat can go up. We know, we like it. We keep moving the ball in those high percentage shots. I've always said how important that is. It's not rocket science, of course. We get it. So let me just say this. So I like that, what he was doing. I like what the offense was doing. Again, our guy, you got a running back there that you love, man. He has taken an early beating, but he's such a tough ass. I don't want to see him getting killed too much because guys are teeing off on him, right? I mean, they're
up. And I think this is true about both teams. Actually, Difficult has a good point here. The Texans need to throw the damn ball. He also said Houston is a good example of constant O-line shuffling, totally wrecking your run game. Like, I mean, and some of the shuffling was essential because of injuries, but and I can't remember exactly the stat. I think I saw it from Brad Spielberger at PFF. But like Dameon Pierce, he had negative yards before contact yesterday, and some of that's granted. The Falcons did a good job with they've gotten some additions up front and Calais Campbell and so forth. But some of that is just insistence on doing it. You would have liked to have seen that not be. And to your point, that's both of these teams, right? Ran the football a lot, probably too much. In an effort not to lose a game against the team. And I think both teams were looking at each other like, hey, we're slightly better than this other team and trying not to lose a game versus trying to win it. And that's really hard to do in the NFL. I was happy to see Kyle Pitts do okay. Jonnu Smith still got like just as many much production as him, which is kind of crazy. But and Drake London really wasn't a thing other than until late in the game. So it's gonna they still have to, I think, go after this. Like, because if this Falcons team were to be 10% better, this is a win a playoff game in the NFC type of team. And so if they stay the way they are, it's just going to be one of those playoff appearances where the team gets killed, like Seattle last year, where they just go and they play San Francisco, and it's a different class of team, and it just doesn't end all that great. And if you're a Falcons fan, you want to see more than that, right? Especially when the NFC, like right now, the third best team in the conference is probably Detroit. So you got a real good opportunity to do some things this year. But you don't get any better by hiding your quarterback. So I think for both teams, they really have to, I think, push it here because, ultimately, if you win, so the best teams like Kansas City and Buffalo, they work through their weaknesses during the season, right? And so it's not as ugly, it's not as good, right? It's uglier. Kansas City wins these ugly games, right? The weaker teams hide them, and then in the playoffs they get exposed. And so I think if you're a team like Atlanta, if you hide your weaknesses all year and you get to the playoffs and get killed, then next year it's just going to get more fair for you, much like Minnesota this year. So when I watch that game, I just want more out of both teams.
Want more. I got frustrated because I know that Atlanta can bring more to the table. And by the way, I didn't get a chance. Ryan Nielsen with the defense, I thought they're throwing it around. I mean, they're an aggressive defense.
Yep.
You get a safety back there. And I love watching him do what he does, right?
Yep.
It's a big acquisition for Terry Fontenot and co, right? They spent a lot of money on some of those guys, but they're flying around. They're doing what they need to do. But then it comes back again. When I'm looking to see, essentially it's two rookie quarterbacks, right? Essentially. Yep. And I know I was texting you. It was like, God, it just feels like, I felt like Houston was saying, look, we're just in it. We're showing well. We're not embarrassing ourselves. Our quarterback's not throwing an interception. Sorry if I'm repeating myself, but that was on my mind a lot, thinking, all right, you get the ball down the field, but ostensibly, and I had not watched the All-22, but they weren't able to move the ball down, or at least CJ wasn't looking down the field. Everyone was like, oh, let's check down here. He wasn't throwing interceptions. Good for him. But it'll be interesting to see how those guys both play, both of those teams. I, unlike you, don't think it was an unbelievably important game. I think it was two teams playing against each other, and you're pumping the media stuff here, but I just think, I think in time it's going to be interesting to see. Not necessarily on a 3-2, right? 3-2.
Yeah. Well, I just look at I just look at so much in this NFL as schedule driven, where I think people look back and actually do the analytics and say, like, I think about this back, way back in the day, like you win 8-8, but your schedule is super easy. Like, we're not going to give you any breaks, that kind of thing. So I just hoping for both teams, obviously, that they can take advantage of it. One did on Sunday, the other didn't. I agree. I think, like, to your point, I just want to see more. Like, I think back to those Panthers years where Cam Newton was a young player and they weren't good, but every game Cam was interesting and it built on itself every single game. I look at the Cardinals, and actually this is really cool. They have a really cool podcast called The Cardinals Rule. And he says, it seems like Atlanta is well equipped to win one kind of game, but well equipped to win. Not well equipped to win if it becomes a boat race. He commented there, and I agree with that. And honestly, the reason I put his comment up there is I think about the Cardinals, right? And the Cardinals, when they play, you're finding stuff out about the Cardinals. Now, they might not be very good, but when I watch their games, I'm thinking to myself, good on you. Way to, find something out about Marquise Brown. Find something, and I know he banged up a little bit, but find something out about your O-line. Find something out about your young players. And if you lose, who gives a, you weren't supposed to win anyway this year. So, has your opinion of Jonathan Gannon gone up or down this year?
It's gone up.
Yeah, and they have the same record as the Patriots, who we just talked about, who were struggling. They have the same record as the Vikings, who were talking about struggling. And yet, my opinion of Austin Fort and my opinion of Gannon have gone up, because when I watch that team has an identity, and that team, when they actually have players, they will be a good football team. And I like watching them. And there are other teams who are like that have been like that in the past. And I feel like those teams always end up being, good eventually. So this has been a great podcast, Thomas. Really appreciate your insight on stuff. We really thank all of you that have come and listened to the show, watched the show. If you can do us a favor, please like the podcast on YouTube. Go to your favorite podcast platform, give us a review, even write us a review. And one of these times when Thomas and I need a little bit of a break, we will do a question and answer session, throw a question into the review as well. So this has been a lot of fun. So Thomas, any parting words?
No, man, you have it all set up today. I'm enjoying listening to you proselytize or whatever you're doing right now.
Well, yeah, no. Awesome. Well, okay. So for Thomas Dimitroff, for Eric Eager, this has been the Sumer Sports Show. Thank you all for coming.